Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to show you some examples on how to attack and defend. Here we go. Here is our first example. Let's examine the position we see right now. Both of the kings are safely castled and seemingly not in any danger. Then, we can see the difference in some of the other pieces. The white queen is still in its initial square, while the black queen is in a rather awkward position, being on b8, right next to the rook that's in the corner. Now that is certainly at least a temporary advantage for white when we compare the two queens. Then let's look at the bishop versus the knight. The white bishop is definitely ideally positioned on the longest diagonal of them all, while the black knight is certainly misplaced on a6, being out of the way where action is, which would be in the middle of the board, or rather on the king's side. The only good thing that is going for black is the fact that the rook on e8 is occupying an open file. If we would not be playing in an ambitious way and would just make a general common sense move, for example rook to e1 to balance the control of the only open file, that would give black the time to recover and get the queen back to the game, for example by trading the rooks. And even though right now the white queen is occupying the open file, black would immediately oppose and offer an exchange of queens. So let's go back to the beginning and think what white may want to do here. In view of the fact that the black queen as well as the black knight are away from the king's side, the black king is rather lonely there, pretty much only defended by the 3 pawns in front of the king. And oftentimes, that's certainly a sign, a red flag, that it's time to start an attack. In this case, clearly, the bishop on b2 is one of the important attacking pieces already aiming towards black g7 pawn, and if you use a little creativity, you can imagine that if a white queen would appear on that very square on g7, the white bishop would be protecting the queen, and indeed that would be a checkmate. So now the only question is how to make it happen. The white queen may move either to d4, threatening with that very checkmate, or alternatively moving the queen to g4 with the very same idea to checkmate again on g7. So the first step is, when you play a game of chess, generally in any given position, to figure out what are your reasonable options. In other words, what are your candidate moves? Once you establish those, like we did here, being queen d4 or queen g4, then you try to compare the two and see which may work out better between the two. At times, of course, there may be more than 2 reasonable moves that you need to compare. Well, even in this case, we already talked about rook e1, which is in a way a reasonable and logical move. There may be others as well, like queen to h5 or queen to f3. However, at this point, let's narrow it down to the 2 I recommended, queen g4 or queen d4, which are the 2 most dynamic and direct approaches trying to checkmate. Of course, if we can checkmate, that always outweighs other type of threats, such as various strategical gains, when you would, let's say, improve the position of your pieces or your pawn structure or such. Let's first examine what may happen if white would start out by playing queen d4. As we said, this is directly threatening to checkmate with queen takes pawn on g7. What may black do about it? Well, if right now the black rook would try to interpose in between the queen on d4 and the pawn on g7, the problem would be that the black rook would kind of find itself in a pin. In other words, white would play f4, attacking black's rook on e5, and then if that rook would move away, of course we would be back to the same problem, checkmate. On the other hand, if after the f4 pawn move the rook does not move away, then black will end up losing that rook. So therefore, this is certainly not a sufficient defense after white would play queen d4. Moving the pawn out of the way would certainly not help at all, because the queen would end up there on g7 again, announcing checkmate. Alternatively, the queen could also move to h8, again with checkmate, a beautiful cooperation between white's bishop and queen. Going back to the position, after queen d4, black only has one reasonable defense, but as so often in chess, that's just enough. In any case, when you have options, at all times you need to pick just one. You do not have the luxury to make 2 or 3 choices. In this case, that only correct choice is to interpose with the pawn rather than with the rook. After playing f6, all of a sudden, black's position is surviving. There is no checkmate on the horizon. So let's go back and compare how is it different if the white queen instead appears on g4. The big difference now is that if black would try to defend the same way by playing f6, the white bishop would get the opportunity to simply capture that pawn. Now the checkmate threat has been renewed. The rook cannot go to e7 because the bishop would just capture it. And if the pawn would move up to g6 at this point, then the white queen would appear on d7 and again threatening the checkmate on g7, and black cannot avoid either the checkmate or loss of significant material. Let's go back again and examine other options for black after queen g4. At this stage, playing rook e5 would immediately mean loss of material by white being able to capture the rook with the bishop and capturing a 5-point piece while giving up an only 3-point piece. In addition, white can consider playing f4 here also, although black may counterattack for a moment with f5. Now the story is, if the queen retreats to g3, still in hopes that if the rook moves away then to checkmate on g7, the rook will move back to e7 and black would be still hanging on. If the queen would move rather to g5 to control the e7 square, then black would respond by playing h6, chasing the queen away again, and when the queen moves to g6, then retreat the rook. It's true that white will still win at least a pawn, but if we compare that to capturing the rook with the bishop on e5 after the first move in this variation, we'll understand that that's clearly the better choice. So, after queen g4, let's talk about black's response g6. Unlike with the variation when the white queen started out on d4 and then after g6 white was ready to checkmate immediately, here that's certainly not the case. However, white, even by a loss of a move, can move the queen to d4 now. What a major difference! Now that the g7 pawn is already on g6, black no longer has support on the f6 square. So if right now black would try to interpose with f6, that pawn would simply be captured and then renewing the same checkmate threats for black. So after queen g4, g6, queen d4, if rook e5, white would respond in a similar way as we've seen before, attacking the rook and kind of using a pin. As if the rook now moves, white is ready to checkmate either in the corner or on g7. So let's go back again and see what happens if right now the black king starts running and plays king f8. Well, white continues chasing the king by playing queen g7, king e7, and rook f to e1. Now, black is completely lost. In fact, black will get checkmated within a few moves. If the king goes to d7, the way we accomplish that is just capture the pawn. As you can see, we're giving check after check, forcing the king into worse and worse positions. And now, simple checkmate. Or, if after the rook check on e1, the king goes to d8, then white's response is to trade rooks, again with check, follow it up with another check, bringing another piece to the attack, king f8, queen check, king d7 only move, and again here comes the checkmate. Well, a very nice and typical example on how to develop an attack when we see that the opponent does not have sufficient defensive pieces near the king. Let's see another such example. Here we are. In this position, if we purely look at the material balance, we'll recognize that even though white has an extra bishop and knight, we'll see that black also has an extra rook and pawn. Purely on the numeric value, that's exactly even, 6 points each. However, we can see that black has weakened his kingside position in that the pawn on g5 supposed to be somewhere back on g7 protecting the king. So that's kind of an invitation for white's attack. Let's see how this may work out in reality. As we already know, the strongest attacking piece of them all is the queen. The queen is a very powerful piece because it can control a lot of key squares all at the same time. And generally speaking, if you can have your queen near the opponent's king, that usually is trouble for the other side. And that's a hint on what should white's next move be. And that correct move is to immediately involve the queen in the attack by playing queen to h5. Right now, the pawn on h6 is hanging, so if black just ignores that, obviously white will capture and win a pawn, but more importantly get even closer to the black king and facilitate white's attack. So the two key moves to look at are what happens if the black king moves next to the pawn on h6 and protects it, for example, by playing king h7. Well, right now it's time to bring more ammunition, namely bring the knight. The knight is another very, very powerful attacking piece because it can jump over pieces and attack all kind of squares real quick. Now white's threat is to simply put the knight on f5 or g4 bringing support to the queen, to then capture the pawn on h6. For example, bringing the queen closer to then try to protect it with queen f6 would fail to the simple knight g4 move, which would then threaten queen h6, and black does not have a reasonable defense. Of course, with that said, also bishop d3 check is an excellent or even better move, because now if the king would try to maintain protecting the pawn on h6, all of a sudden knight f5 check would fork the black king and queen. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning one more time. Queen h5, let's see what happens if after the king h7 move, which we discussed a minute ago, and knight e3, black tries now to play f5 with the idea to control the g4 square and also prevent the knight from coming to f5. Well, it only seemingly prevents it. In reality, white can still move or capture on f5, because now if rook captures, the rook will get into a very unpleasant pin. White follows up with bishop d3, and after the rook gets protected, white will simply use the pin by attacking the f5 rook with the pawn. And then, as the end of the story, white will just capture the rook and be a bishop ahead. Let's go back to the very beginning, when after queen h5, black's other option is to play king g7 instead of king h7. The good side of this move is that it avoids any future bishop d3 moves to arrive with a check. Now the king is in a dark square, so therefore that's not a problem. The problem, on the other hand, is that when the white knight comes to e3, then the knight f5 check will be coming forcefully. If now black plays f5, which is relatively the best defense, then white will continue playing aggressively, trying at by all means achieve that the knight would get to f5 and plays bishop e6, attacking the f5 pawn a second time, and black does not have any reasonable ways to protect that pawn. On the other hand, when and if the pawn advances, then the white knight is ready to arrive to f5 indeed, and the h6 pawn will be lost. Black will be in serious trouble. The relatively best response to avoid the immediate checkmate is to give up material, either by rook captures knight or retreating the king to the corner, but then the h6 pawn, and most likely followed the g5 pawn, will be lost. Now let's see another example, which is actually from a real grandmaster game. This position has been reached by one of the top French grandmasters at the time, Jean Lothier, against the world champion of today, that is in 2010, Vishy Anand from India. In this position, it was black's turn. And let's examine for a moment on what's going on here. Materially speaking, we can see that we have even balance. A queen on each side, a rook on each side, and a bishop versus knight, and even number of pawns as well. So here, the key is in which side can develop some kind of threats or attack against the other side. Based on the pawn structure, at first it seems that actually white's king is in a safer position than black's, as black's g-pawn already has been moved to f6, doubling up. Nevertheless, despite the first appearance, it is the white king who gets in trouble first. Anand continued in this position by playing queen e4, a very powerful move with dual threats. The main threat being the rook coming down to e1 with a check, which would obviously fork the white king and queen. Not less importantly, black also created a second threat by pinning the pawn on g2 and threatening next to capture on h3. White played king h2, trying to defend against both. After king h2, black has to play forcefully and plays queen f4, check. Now, if the king moves back to h1, obviously black will not repeat moves, but will use a newly created discovery opportunity, namely rook capturing the pawn on h3 and then simply grabbing the unprotected queen on c1. After queen f4, white played king g1. Now the black rook does not have any good discovered checks. If the rook would move right now to e1, even though it's a check, the white queen would simply capture it. However, now came queen g3, again simply renewing that threat of rook e1. White resigned at this stage. Here is how the game could have ended. If white plays king f1, preventing rook e1, then black simply brings the next piece onto the attack, knight f4, threatening to checkmate, and after queen d2, a very nice finish and elegant finish by a rook sacrifice. Rook e1 check, queen takes, and checkmate. A very nice could have been end. White didn't want to see the final position on the board, therefore resigned 3 moves earlier. Let's move on and see the next example, which is quite brilliant. In this position, white has a strong attack both from the 7th rank as well through the g file. The problem is that the black queen is in between that crossfire. So for example, if queen would capture on f7, rook would capture back, black would be just fine as the rook check could be blocked again. So going back to our starting position, we need to think what to do, how to create a threat that black cannot defend against. And this is a difficult move, but I hope you'll enjoy and you'll learn from it for one of your future games. White here can play the brilliant queen e6. Now, what happens? The rook all of a sudden is threatening the black queen. The black queen cannot capture the white rook because it is in a pin. And if the queen captures the queen, that would allow the typical double rook checkmate on the 7th rank, starting out with the rook from g1, followed by check and checkmate. A brilliant combination. And let's see one more final position on how to develop attacks. Here we are. In this wild position, white has already sacrificed 2 pieces. However, the black king cannot castle, and white still has the attack going strong. White could capture the bishop on g7, but at this moment, that's not the most important thing. It is more important to go after black's king. And that's exactly what white did in the game by playing queen e6 check. If right now the king moves out of the check, white is ready to bring in the rook to the attack with rook d7, forcing black to give up the queen. The game continued with black rather blocking the check with the knight. And white now is threatening to capture black's knight on f7. The knight moved away to h6, and now again it's a key moment. While white may have other good ways as well. The best one certainly is to check, force the trade on d8. Now it's a double check with both queens, so the king must capture. And then after rook d1, black is getting checkmated on the next couple of moves. Well, I hope you got a better idea on how to develop attacks when the opponent is vulnerable. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week. Bye-bye.